everyone. Today we're going to be looking at the stages of editing, particularly for short stories. This isn't a comprehensive list at all, so it's not going to be everything that you would ever need to do, but it's a really good place to start, particularly if you're editing a short story and you want to make it as good as it can be. There's 3 stages that you want to go through. So let's look at stage 1. Stage 1 is all about accuracy. This is like getting the language right, getting it accurate and getting it correct. So the first thing you want to do, ensure that you've used capital letters where needed and haven't used capital letters where they shouldn't be. They shouldn't be floating in the middle of sentences. Proper nouns should be capitalized. All those basic things. Generally that's a result of carelessness rather than not knowing where they go. So just double check that all those things exist. You know, the I, if we're talking about I did this, I did that, I should be capitalized. So just make sure that you've done that. Then check your spelling. Run it through a spell checker, but also get someone else to have a look, because sometimes you can have the right spelled word, the right spelling of a word, but it's the wrong word to use. So just double check those. Check your dialogue formatting and paragraphing. Google dialogue formatting if you need to, but generally there's, you need to have a starting quote mark and an ending quote mark, and there should be punctuation coming out of those quotes normally. Also, every time there's a new speaker, you need to be going to a new paragraph. So there should never be 2 people speaking in the same line or on the same paragraph. You always just hit enter, go to the next line to make it nice and clear. Sometimes that means you'll have really long lists of dialogue. That's okay. Next, run it through Grammarly or another website like this to double check some of the finer details. Now, keep in mind Grammarly is American spelling, so don't necessarily go if they're trying to change S's to Z's in words like capitalize or whatever. Be careful of that, but it's a good way just to get another safety net looking for errors. Then look for overusing words. He did this, he did this, he did this, and then he went to the thing, and then he went or whatever. Suddenly is a really common student word to use. That is suddenly this and suddenly that. Just is another one. So just look for words that you are overusing, that you're using too much, and try to either delete them, a lot of the time you don't even need them, or change them up for other words. Take out filter words. Now, filter words are words that come between the reader and the character. Things like he thought, he saw, he heard, he wondered. Thought, saw, heard, and wondered are all filter words that take us out of the mind of the character. You could say, he saw a bus coming down the street. Well, that's just as clear. If we're inside the character's perspective, a bus came down the street is better because it's clearer. We don't see him seeing the bus, we see the bus. We're more inside his head. A classic one was, where was he? He thought to himself. That he thought to himself isn't needed, because if we're following his story, if we're following kind of his perspective, we understand if they're writing, where was he? And we're inside his head, that's what he's thinking. So you don't need to tell us he thought, he wondered, etc. It's much, much better if you just have it straight. So just describe what it is as if we're inside his head rather than saying all these filter words here. And then look for repeated words in sentences that aren't there for effect. So, you might say he quickly did this and then quickly did this and so on. If you're repeating those kind of keywords or nouns or adjectives and they're not there for effect, like you're not trying to create a sense of repetition there, then be sure to change those up. Okay, stage 2. Once we've done the basic accuracy, now we're getting into style and flow. This is about having it read really nicely. Now it's accurate, now it's going to be like really excellent. This is going to take it to the next level. Number 1, avoid more than 2 adverbs every 1,000 words or so. So in a 500 word short story, you'd have maybe 1 adverb. Generally speaking, adverbs can be replaced by more interesting words, so more interesting verbs, or you can replace them with language techniques like similes or metaphor. So instead of he ran quickly, he sprinted maybe, or he jogged if you're trying to go for a different impression. He was across the street in a second would be a metaphor that would communicate the idea that he's running quickly. So generally speaking, unless you don't have to use an adverb, you can use them, but very, very sparingly. It's always best to not overuse those. Okay, is there a strong sense of setting? Do we get a really good sense of the location? where they are. Even if it's not the most interesting location in the world, we need a sense of detail so that we can see them in that space. Where are things? What does the room feel like? What does the field look like? What are the little details? Now with setting, here's a little trick. You want to think of it like a film. So in a film, when we are introduced to a setting, we get this big picture often, don't we? Like the big long shot where we can see the sunset or whatever. But then we come in, the camera moves in, and we might see a character walking through the field. And then the camera might move in again, and we'll see, them running their hand through the blades of grass while there's a butterfly. So it's a bit cliche, but you get the idea. We start big, and then we zoom in, and then we zoom in. It's the same in writing. You can start small and zoom out if you want as well, but think of those 3 levels. What's the whole space like? What's the character doing in that space? And then what's the little details? What's our close-up that's going to really make that space come alive? Okay, make sure dialogue is easy to follow by adding dialogue tags when needed. A dialogue tag is things like he said, she said, he whispered. Now, it's really, really tempting to overdo dialogue tags and have descriptions for how they say all these lines. He said sadly, he shouted loudly, she whispered suspiciously, all that kind of stuff. Again, that's coming back to our adverb rule for starters, but we want to avoid overdoing dialogue tags because it gets really clunky. He said and she said are essentially invisible to the reader. Is that we don't really pay too much attention to them, but they help us keep on track with who's talking. So if you've got more than a few lines of dialogue and you don't have any dialogue tags, you need them in there. Otherwise, you're writing a script. And if you do, just make sure they're not overdone. It's always better, instead of he said sadly, you could say he said, looking at the ground, or he said shoulders slumped. So try and give us a physical description of how they're saying it. What's their body doing? What's their face doing? That will generally communicate it better than things like sadly and happily and all that kind of thing. Okay, use more interesting words and complex specific vocabulary. So instead of he was old, we could have he was ancient, if he's like really old, or his hair was streaked with grey. We're being a little more poetic there. Again, these aren't the most amazing examples in the world, but they're more interesting than he was old. So try and use more interesting vocab. Upgrade the words that you're using. Use more interesting words. You can overdo this and end up with a text that's unreadable because you've thesaurused every word. Please don't do that. But try and make it more interesting and use better language. Okay, look for sentences that start the same way. I walked to the sink. I washed the dishes. I finished and I sat down. It starts to get really repetitive. So, I walked to the sink, washing the dishes, whatever. So just by rearranging the structure of your sentences, you'll avoid these repetitive starts, which starts to get really, really samey and really choppy over time. Also look for sentences that end the same way. He walked into the room, it was a dark room. He walked into the room, it was dark. That's enough. But again, when we end sentences the same way, it kind of feels like we're trying to rhyme or something and it doesn't quite work. So just look for those, particularly in writing. I is really, really common, or she. Try and change up the structure of those sentences so you're not overdoing those things. On that note, examine your sentence structure. Do you have too many simple sentences? That's like what I was just saying. I walked to the sink. I did this. This happened. This. Short collections of words, just single clauses with full stops. It'll be real choppy if you have a lot of those in a row. Also, are the complex sentences structured differently? So as you're building those complex sentences by adding in commas and conjunctions, things like and, but, what is it, fanboys for, and nor, but, or yet, or so. As you're including those conjunctions, make sure that you're still changing the structure of those sentences. Often, and this is really common, students use the 2-part sentence, it kind of gets overused. He walked into the room, slowly looking around him. It was dark in there, and the windows were boarded shut. If you do that too often, particularly that 2 clause separated by a comma, it's really, really common. It gets really repetitive because it's just part 1, part 2, part 1, comma, part 2, part 1, comma, part 2. It gets very samey still. So you've got more complex sentences, yes, but you're not doing it on purpose. So think about how those simple and complex sentences flow. You can use simple sentences when you want it to be short, sharp, and punchy, and then more complex sentences when you're wanting to build maybe to something or create a rhythm. So just have a look at it. Okay, do we get a sense of the character's mood and personality through the way words have been used? Are we getting the tone? Are we getting how they feel about things? Sometimes students make the mistake of having the character be kind of like a GoPro, right? So we experience the story through this neutral film that's just strapped to the character's head, and they go around it like a video game character with very little sense of agency or interpretation. What we want to be doing, rather than having the character as a neutral camera, we want to experience the story through them, through their body, through their mind, through their thoughts. So we're going to get how they interpret the world. If they're angry, everything's going to annoy them, and they're going to be using words that change the way that you interpret things, change the way that we feel about things. If they tend to really notice interesting details, then we want to be noticing those interesting details in the story. So your character needs to feel alive. They're filtering the story for us, and we're experiencing it through them, or we're experiencing their life. Are the paragraph breaks in the right place? And do they create a sense of pacing? So make sure, first of all, that you're having paragraph breaks if you've got particularly a change in time, or a change in main focus of the action, or a change in what the character's thinking about, or if they're changing from thinking about something to doing something. You probably want a paragraph break there. There's no super hard and fast rules for this. Don't just paragraph, if in doubt, paragraph. That's a bad idea. But when you have longer paragraphs, they tend to be more descriptive and tend to flow a little bit more. If you have shorter paragraphs, they tend to speed action up. Thrillers tend to use short, punchy paragraphs, for example, whereas literary works will tend to use the longer, more flowy paragraphs. But you can switch between them. So if you're giving us a really nice sense of where they are, use longer paragraphs. And then if there's some action, then use the shorter paragraphs to speed things up. And then editing stage 3 is our final read. So this is where we check it all over again. We double check everything. So have others do a final read over it. That's really important. Get other people to look at your work. And then do a final read from start to finish, preferably out loud to make sure it's totally polished. Out loud feels weird, but the reason is this. If you read it out loud, it forces you to stop and read every word. You don't skim at that point and just go, oh yeah, it's all right. You'll notice if there's a word that isn't quite right. You'll notice if a word doesn't fit. And you'll notice if it's clunky anywhere. So when people are reading, often we have the same kind of internal monologue as when it's being read out loud. And if those words are clunky, or they don't flow nicely, we'll tend to stumble over them in our head as well as we're reading them. So what we want to do is have a really nice sense of flow through that story. If you're stumbling over words and you're going, oh, well, that's really blah, 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 that's hard to say, then you probably need to change the language so that it reads really nicely, so that as the reader is reading, there is that sense of flow. And reading it out loud is a really helpful way to do that if it's not something that you've done before. So go forth, edit, go through those 3 stages. There'll be a copy of the checklist available. Go through, make sure you do them all and tick them off to make your stories the absolute best they can be.